Hey, welcome to Woodwork for Humans, the series where we make great stuff out of wood using the bare minimum tools. This week, I'm gearing up for my $30 workbench build. Because if we're going to expand this series and start doing more interesting things, we're going to need a bigger, sturdier work surface, but it's still going to have to be simple and cheap. To make something like a workbench, you're going to need a saw. So far, I've been using the Vaughan Bear Saw. This is by far my favorite off-the-shelf grab-and-go saw for fine and medium woodwork. It's perfect for that stuff. But I can't use it for heavy stock prep. If I go cutting big boards with this and breaking down my stock, it's going to take a long time, and this saw is going to wear out really quickly, because it's just not intended for that stuff. For the more ambitious, larger projects that I have coming, I'm going to need something bigger and heavier. So, I went down to the home center, and I picked up this DeWalt handsaw. This is exactly what you would see on a job site where carpenters are framing out a house or doing similar rough work. And, so far, it looks okay. It's got a nice sort of stealth black coating. The teeth feel extremely sharp. The handle is, well, we'll talk about the handle later. But it looks like it's okay. What's weird about this, though, is I have never, ever seen a fine woodworker or a furniture maker use a saw like this. Even though they're common and they're really cheap. I bought this for under 20 bucks. Why is that? Why does essentially nobody use these saws? Is it because they're bad? Or is it because woodworkers are, kind of snobs? For my hand tool woodworking, I like old hand saws, like this big old Diston crosscut saw here. Saws like this are really fantastic for woodworking because they work really well. They're durable, they're inexpensive, and there is a million of them out there. I've bought a bunch of saws like this for under $5, sometimes as little as $1. Here's another one that I bought recently, and it wasn't expensive, but this saw really illustrates the problems you can have with vintage hand saws. This saw is considered to be in good condition, or at least fair condition, but it still needs a lot of work before it's going to cut any wood. A saw like this needs rust removal. The teeth need to be jointed. The teeth need to be shaped, and sharpened, and set. You might have to take a little bit of that set back out again. The handle usually needs work, including repairs and usually refinishing. And all of this stuff requires gear. You need files, a jointing jig, and a saw vise. Now, of course, a saw vise is one of those things you can make yourself, but that's just another project. And you need to do all of this stuff before you can just cut some damn wood. So for now, I think we need to skip all of this stuff. Go down to the hardware store, get a saw that's sharp and ready to go, and do some woodwork. So, the criticism that you hear of saws like this is that these are disposable hardpoint saws. And what that means is when these are manufactured, there's a little machine that comes down along the line and zaps each tooth with a little pulse of electricity. And that has the effect of super hardening the tooth. It actually makes it just as hard or even harder than the file you would use to sharpen it with. And that means that this DeWalt saw is not sharpenable. When the saw gets dull, you really are going to be throwing it away. But because the teeth have been hardened to such an insane degree, it's probably going to take a long time for that saw blade to wear out. If we're doing hobby woodwork, I bet it's going to last like a year, maybe more. And if you're spending 20 bucks a year on one good rough cutting saw, well, shoot, I probably spend 20 bucks a year on the files that I use to sharpen all of my reusable saws. So this could end up being a pretty good deal. So the only thing to do now is to put this saw through some tests and see how well it actually works. I came up with 5 different things that I think are really important about the performance of any saw. First thing is, how easy is this saw to start? You usually start a saw by drawing a line on your work, putting your thumbnail or your thumb knuckle near that saw to guide the blade, and then drawing it back over your line a couple of times. This establishes a curve, and then you can usually start pushing forward and making your actual cut. The DeWalt is not easy to start. Even after I've gotten the kerf going, it really wants to jump out of that kerf and move around. The teeth are very sharp and they're very aggressive, and that makes it tough to get into a rhythm. How does this compare to my vintage Diston? Well, honestly, the Diston's pretty similar. It might be a little bit easier to start, especially because I sharpen my own saws, and so I usually take a portion of the teeth and make the rake, the angle of the tooth, a little bit less severe, and that makes them easier to get going. But even with that custom sharpening, I have to establish the kerf, and the saw still wants to jump out sometimes. Both of the saws I'm talking about here are relatively rough saws for rough work. And the way the teeth are designed, they're trading ease of starting for power and speed in the cut. It's a trade-off that's tough to get around, and most craftsmen seem to think it's okay. Of course, once you get your cut started, you want to power through it kind of quickly, and so speed really matters. I tested out both of my saws by drawing 4 lines and making 4 cuts with each one of them, and then I timed them with a stopwatch. And the result was that both saws cut at roughly the same speed. For both saws, it took between 30 and 35 seconds on average for me to cross-cut a fir 2x4. Now, if I worked with these kind of rough saws more often, I'd probably get quicker than that. And I'm sure there are carpenters and tradesmen watching this who can cross-cut faster than I can. And awesome! Good for you! Either way, these two saws seem to cut at more or less the same speed, and they're both pretty quick. With any saw that you use, you need it to track, which means the saw needs to follow a line pretty closely. Both the saws I'm looking at here are rough cutting saws, so a little bit of wandering is acceptable, but you can't have a straight cut end up like this. That's not going to work. And with both the Diston and the DeWalt, I found that they were decent at following a line. They weren't perfect, like a joinery saw should be, but they weren't terrible either. It didn't take a lot of control, I didn't have to strangle either one of them. I was more or less able to glide my way through the cut and get a straight and plumb line at the end. Now, these are coarse-cutting saws, but we still care about the finish they leave on the wood. So I have a bunch of the scraps here that I cut off, and I can just look at these to see what the saw finish is like. And honestly, after making 20 or 25 cuts with the saws, I have no idea which of these scraps was the DeWalt and which one was the Diston. They all look the same. They're all pretty flat and smooth on the cutting edge and relatively ragged and splintery down at the bottom where the saw comes out of the cut. In other words, they're both exactly what you would expect from a rough cut saw that's made for breaking down stock quickly on a job site. I also want to look at ergonomics. How does the saw feel in the hand? And do I get any pain or cramping? Is there anything about the saw that's going to make my work more difficult? And here, the Diston is the clear winner. You would think that an old-timey saw like this wouldn't have a good sense of ergonomics in the design, but that's just not true. Your hand just melts into this handle. It is bulgy where it needs to be bulgy, skinny where your fingers and knuckles need to go. This rear horn here cradles the space between your thumb and your forefinger. It feels fantastic in the hand, and I find using this saw is not very fatiguing at all. The DeWalt, on the other hand, is a bit of an ergonomic disaster. I don't like the handle at all. It is immediately much less inviting. The handle is incredibly thick, and that's a weird thing for me to say because I have enormous hands, and this still feels like too much handle to me. I can only imagine if I were on a job site and wearing gloves, I would have a hard time getting my hand around this thing. But that being said, it has that nice sort of rubber butylene overmold whatever stuff that makes it grippy. It's got some little lines cast into it which help, and it has this nice depression right here to encourage you to pistol grip the saw. Pointing your finger while you're sawing allows it to track much straighter, and it's a good feature to have. I don't like the handle of this saw, but it's also only attached by 3 regular Phillips head screws, so it would be nothing to pop this handle off, make a better one out of wood, and put it on. And then I could just keep that handle and change out the blade when it got dull. My handle problem would be solved forever, and it would be a nice little afternoon woodworking project. Because a lot of the woodwork I do is furniture making, it was also very important for me to test out the DeWalt on some hardwood. So I grabbed a nice, dense piece of white oak and did a few cuts with that. And I found that it was really similar to the saw's performance in softwood. It was very difficult to start and wanted to jump around a lot, but once I got it going, it made a clean and straight crosscut in my white oak. I also drew a line and practiced a rip cut, and it was especially difficult to get started on that end grain, but then once I did, it tracked a line nicely and it powered through the cut quite quickly. I actually didn't notice any difference in speed between softwoods and hardwoods with using the DeWalt. So I think that saw is going to be completely fine for both ripping and cross-cutting pretty much any wood I want to use. So, can you use a saw like this for real hand tool woodworking? Well, of course you can. I mean, listen, I am no huge fan of big tool conglomerates like DeWalt, but they aren't stupid either. They've got like engineers and stuff working on this. Of course, if they're going to put out a handsaw and charge almost 20 bucks for it, they're going to make sure it does at least some things well. And this saw does. It's a perfectly reasonable saw for ripping and cross-cutting softwoods and hardwoods. And when you need to do fast breakdown of stock to move on to the finer work, that's all you need. You just need kind of a big, dumb saw that can power through your stuff. And this thing more or less fits the bill. Do I love it? No. It's not really as good as my vintage Distant. It cuts similarly, but it's lighter and it doesn't glide quite as nicely in the cut, and the handle makes my hand hurt a little bit. But if I had to get woodworking right away, would I go out to a flea market and get a saw and then buy all the stuff and fix it up? No, I wouldn't. I did all that stuff because I love woodworking and I find tools interesting. But if my focus was making a project right now, right this second, I'd just go get one of these. And so I can recommend it without any real reservation, and I've got a link to it in the description if you want to grab one. I picked up this saw because this week I'm also releasing my video on my $30 workbench, and that's going to be a fun and fantastic project for cash-strapped people who want to get started woodworking right now. And videos like this are only possible because of my patrons on Patreon. They kick in the money that makes it possible for me to do things like buy saws that I don't actually need. I don't need this saw. I own a bunch of saws. I bought it because I want to show more people how to get started really quickly. And the income that I get from Patreon helps me make more videos, help more people, and it makes my content better, I guess. So go to patreon.com/RexKruger and consider chipping in $1 here or there. It really helps me make this content possible. And for everybody who's just watching this video, I love having viewers. Thanks for watching.